Father Oscar Romero was a priest in El Salvador, and he was known as a conservative drudge when he was appointed bishop there in 1977, which is exactly why he was appointed, because he was bookish and more concerned with heady theology than public policy. He was considered a safe choice for the powers of the day. It was a time of real upheaval in El Salvador. Over the course of the 70s, there were several coups by the military, including one in 1979 that overthrew a democratically elected president. But when Romero's friend and fellow priest, who was organizing the poor, was killed by government forces in 1977, Romero could not unsee what he had seen. And he evolved, and he became an outspoken critic of the government, and for his efforts, he was assassinated while saying Mass in 1980, 30 years ago. Several months later, 4 American Catholic nuns, also politically active, were killed by government forces. The response of the government of the United States to those murders was telling. Instead of condemning the killings or calling for justice, the Reagan and Bush the first administrations were more concerned with countering the imagined threat of communism in Central America, and they believed that the existing government in El Salvador would reliably resist any threat to capitalism. So instead of insisting on respect for basic human rights or maybe calling for some accountability, they poured $3.7 billion into that little country from 1980 to 1989, with 70% of that money going for weapons. As the weapons flowed in, the violence escalated, and El Salvadorians fled and are still fleeing. And we see them now in the refugee crisis at our borders. This is a sermon about living with integrity in systems that don't have integrity. Those systems might be governments or corporations or religions. We're here as individuals trying to do our best, but stuck in enormous webs that are beyond our control and that we see are flawed or even immoral. What does this do to us? What does it do to our spirits? And what can we do about it? As your minister, I hear how exhausted people are. I hear the resignation and all the fatigues, outrage fatigue, compassion fatigue, fatigue. This has been an unusually bad flu season for our community. I just had it last week, actually. And I can't help but wonder if it's not related to the extra layer of stress that these ugly times place on us. I know that I feel it. So this is an attempt at a pastoral sermon. Despite the story I just told you, I'm not trying to trigger anyone's outrage. I'm hoping instead that this sermon can offer some ways to endure this moment with our integrity intact. I think there's a spiritual concept that's useful to describe the moment we're in, and perhaps you've heard of it. It's called moral injury. Moral injury is the condition that results when someone commits an act or allows an act to happen that they know to be wrong, deep in their core, based on their most deeply held sense of what is right. Moral injury is commonly associated with folks in the military because of the no-win situations that they can be placed in, but it's not just for soldiers. I've spoken with public school teachers who brought their very highest ideals to the classroom, only to find themselves in the role of delivering an education system that they felt was not only inadequate, but actively harmful to children. Any line of work that involves idealism creates a risk of moral injury because the work is lined up with a sense of identity, with what is virtuous. I think being a citizen of a country that espouses such noble values as the United States, it really does espouse noble values. But that places us at risk as well. The effect of moral injury on a person depends on how bad the act is and what other kinds of supports a person has. People who have developed spiritual resiliency from practicing a faith or simply having the support of family and friends can sometimes recover just on their own. But folks who are involved in something very severe and who don't have the built-in support or of a religious practice or family members, their symptoms can involve self-destructive behaviors. Those behaviors can run the gamut from substance abuse to self-sabotage of one's career and relationship, all the way up to taking one's own life. In English folklore, there are stories about people called sin eaters. Sin eaters. When someone died, the sin eater would come to where the body lay in vigil. And in some versions of the story, the sin eater would eat a meal directly off the chest of the deceased. In others, they just wave the food over the body and then eat it. And this process would transfer a lifetime of accumulated sins from the dead person to the sin eater. And the deceased person would go to heaven with a clean slate. They never actually describe what happens to the sin eater. Just being in society creates situations in which every choice involves some kind of wrongdoing. In those cases, people forced to do something that they know that is wrong, the person who ends up with moral injury, they're a kind of sin eater. They eat the sins of a society that won't take responsibility for its own actions. So that soldier kicking down doors at night, that teacher who's told to teach to the standardized test, that judge forced to give a minimum sentence that doesn't fit the crime, they're sin eaters suffering moral injury on behalf of all of us. Most of us here are taxpayers, citizens in this country, unwilling parties to a moment in which we're forced on a daily basis to witness and in some minimal way be complicit with things that we know are not right. And as an aside, I just want to say the next sermon I preach will not be such a downer. But I think it needs to be said. Anyways, I think that lots of folks are feeling a degree of moral injury simply by being here at this moment, simply by being Americans, and that's hard. This afternoon, I'm flying to El Salvador, 2:00 flight, to spend a week of my study leave being educated on the state of human rights in that unlucky country. The trip is organized by the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice in coordination with the Salvadorian group Cristosal. It's all clergy on the trip, mostly UU, but I think there's a couple of Episcopalian priests, maybe a Mennonite or two in there. Anyways, we'll be meeting with groups that are working with citizens to repair the torn fabric of the country. It's a moment of relative optimism in El Salvador, believe it or not. 6 months ago, a new president took office. He's 39 years old. He's widely supported, and he's talking a good game about economic development and fighting corruption. I'm going to El Salvador in an attempt to recover a tiny piece of integrity. I know my presence there won't make up for those $3.7 billion that the U.S. gave the brutal leaders of that country in the 80s, which, by the way, the 80s was the time when I was serving as an officer in the Marine Corps. So I am complicit. I never served in Latin America, but I was part of the system. I'm hoping that I can be a witness, maybe bring a perspective back to share with the good people of this congregation. I'll be preaching on what I learned on February 9th, and I hope that you'll be there. Now, I understand that picking up and going to Central America is actually a huge luxury, and it's just not realistic for folks with limited means or conventional jobs or families. So how do all of us figure out ways to live with integrity in a broken system? Or at a minimum, how do we find the inspiration to carry on despite our fatigue, our genuine fatigue? And I offer a suggestion. You may know of Bayard Rustin, the man who supported Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and who was the genius of logistics behind the historic 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Mr. Rustin once said, "We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers." Angelic troublemakers. Well, I want to tell you about two angelic troublemakers who might inspire us, or at minimum remind us that there are people with integrity who have been around and who are around. First, I want to tell you about an unlikely angelic troublemaker related to Central America. So, United States Marine Corps General Smedley Butler served for 34 years in the first half of the 20th century. He participated in military actions in the Philippines, in China, in Central America, including Honduras, and the Caribbean during the Banana Wars, and in France in World War I. He's the most decorated Marine ever. He twice won the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is an award you usually get posthumously, and he got them both times for being alive, which is amazing. He's one of the best nicknames I've ever come across in the Marine Corps. They called him Old Gimlet Eye. Old Gimlet Eye. And I can't imagine what it was like to have him glare at you. Well, over the course of his career, he became more and more disenchanted. And he was very outspoken when he was on active duty. And after he was retired, all bets were off. So in 1935, he wrote a bombshell essay entitled, "War is a Racket." This is a two-star general writing a book, an essay entitled, "War is a Racket." And he traveled the country giving lectures. And I want to give you a little taste of what he was saying. "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the toppling of a half-dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make the Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents." End of quote. Nice work, Old Gimlet Eye. And the amazing thing is that even after saying all these things, the Marine Corps named a base after him in Okinawa, Japan, Camp Butler. Now, obviously, General Butler didn't dismantle the military-industrial complex, but he used his position and his privilege to speak truth to power. And for that, he earns the angelic troublemaker status. I want to tell you about a contemporary angelic troublemaker now. Her name is Siobhan OConnor. And this is not a story about Central America, but it is one about living with integrity in a system that does not have it. Siobhan OConnor was the executive assistant to the Bishop of the Buffalo, New York Catholic Diocese for 3 years until 2018. Siobhan OConnor is a devout Catholic. She actually spent some time in a Dominican convent for a while before she decided that wasn't the path. She loved her job, and she felt like a granddaughter to Bishop Malone. However, her feelings started to sour as she began to see how Bishop Malone was responding to reports of cases of abuse by priests in the diocese. He would be dismissive of the victims, treating them as threats rather than people to be protected and nurtured. And things came to a head one day when her boss was out of the office, and being a good executive assistant, she decided to do some deep cleaning. So she went to the vacuum closet, going through the drawers of a storage cabinet. And it was there that she found a huge 3-ring binder buried in the 3rd drawer. She quickly realized that it was the complete list of abuse cases that had been given to the bishop the month after he started in that role. The list was more than twice as long as what the bishop had said it was publicly. And it was clear to O'Connor that Bishop Malone had lied and then literally hidden the binder in the bottom of a closet of cleaning supplies. She cried as she read through the cases, and she was afraid that her tears would mark the binder and give her away. By the way, every bishop chooses a motto for their tenure as bishop. Bishop Malone's was, "Live the truth in love." O'Connor brought her concerns to the bishop, and he told her not to worry about it because he was handling it. He was not handling it. Siobhan OConnor decided that she had to act. As a person of deep faith, in her religious terms, she realized that her loyalty to God was more important than her loyalty to the bishop. So in 2018, she made copies of every document she could get her hands on. She gave them to a local TV reporter who was covering the scandal, and she resigned. She instantly became a lightning rod in a very Catholic city. Buffalo is very Catholic. And she's being by nature a very private person. This was incredibly hard for her. She didn't even have a Facebook account. But she knew it was worth it. Bishop Malone clung to his position for a year, but could no longer hold out when Pope Francis asked him to resign. At great personal cost, Siobhan OConnor clung to her integrity, and she brought integrity to a deeply broken system. And she also repaired a breach with many, many victims who felt ignored and ill-used. Using the language of her spiritual tradition, Siobhan OConnor lost her job but saved her soul. Our reading by W.H. Auden today talks about the distance from the noble things that we aspire to, for example, in the poem, the ideals of the Christmas holiday, and our workaday lives, the distance between those two. And he's not trying to make people feel guilty. He's in it with us, writing in the first person plural, using we, and I think he's consoling us, with the truth that it's always hard to live up to our ideals, our lofty ideals all the time. As Auden writes, the time being, in a sense, is the most trying time of all. This, right now, is a trying time. We see how far we are from the vision. But if we are Americans, let's look to our heroes. We may not be able to be angelic troublemakers ourselves, but we can celebrate them. And let's celebrate integrity any place we can find it. And perhaps let's let a little of their integrity seep into us. And may we make it through this difficult time with our integrity intact. Amen, and blessed be.
I invite you to rise and